Life Unrehearsed, brought to you by Lianas Senior Transition Support, specialists in downsizing and seniors residences.
My name is Matt Delvecchio, specializing in life transitions, downsizing in the senior living industry.
And I'm Corrie Matt, clinical social worker and author of Someone Died, Now What? I think we have to give a very special shout out to all fathers today. Happy Father's Day to all the dads, granddads, stepdads, heavenly dads, and those who play the role of dad. So it could be anyone who you define as dad. Very, very special. Happy Father's Day, Matt. Happy Father's Day to my dad and my father-in-law, and happy Father's Day to you. What's up for you, Matt?
Well, thank you very much, Corrie. And yes, happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. And of course, I want to wish a happy Father's Day to my dad as well. And what's going on? Well, I have a very special Father's Day plan. I'm actually going golfing with my dad tomorrow, and we're going to have a little barbecue after. So, geez, after a year and a half, he hasn't been over for a long, long time. So looking forward to a very, very special day. And believe me, in my world, working with seniors in transition, I don't take anything for granted. I'm very blessed that I have this opportunity. So happy Father's Day, Dad, and to all the dads out there. Corrie, we've got a very interesting guest coming up. Looking forward to hearing from Marissa.
Absolutely. Marissa Miller is the author of Pretty Weird, Overcoming Imposter Syndrome and Other Oddly Empowering Lessons. Marissa is also a freelance journalist for publications including The New York Times, Vogue, CNN, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Women's Health, and more. I want to talk a little bit about the book. I've read it. It's fascinating. And Pretty Weird, it's a series of true stories that are at once relatable, funny, and heart-wrenching. And you really do learn about why, like Marissa, all of us are worthy of success by virtue of thinking, even though that we're not, about why there's no such thing as being not sick enough to deserve help, and that living in the liminal space of being too normal to stand out, yet too weird to fit in, is truly where all the magic actually happens. Marissa, welcome to Life Unrehearsed.
Thank you for having me. What a lovely introduction.
Well, you deserve it. You earned it. It's really, I was in awe. Talk to us about why you wrote the book.
So I wrote the book so that others wouldn't feel so alone, in those feelings of unworthiness. We're taught to excel, we're taught to succeed and thrive, but we never talk about the way sort of it takes our identity and our sense of self to catch up to that. And so there's this dissonance between the person I think I am, the person that you potentially think you are. And so that's a really flawed and messy and complicated journey to kind of come to a place where you feel like you are deserving of your accomplishments. So this book is really a place for people to navigate that unfamiliar territory and feel connected to others, including myself, in that same position.
And I think, Marissa, I think it's so relatable to many, many people. What you're describing right there, I think, describes a lot of people. And you talk in the book about imposter syndrome. I find it quite fascinating, and because it is real as well. Can you tell us what is imposter syndrome?
Sure. So imposter syndrome is a psychological phenomenon. And while it is not included in the DSM-5, which is sort of like the psychological Bible, if you will, it can manifest itself as depression and anxiety, which are very real and debilitating disorders. But essentially, it's described as being unable to internalize success or take credit for it, feel it's deserved, and instead you find yourself chalking it up to luck or coincidence. And that can be very confusing because, like I said, we're expected to take joy in our accomplishments, but it can be very isolating to feel like you're unworthy of those accomplishments and that you're going to be found out as a fraud. So it's most common in minority groups who historically have had to prove their worth in the workplace and otherwise, but it's also common among high-achieving women like myself who really tie their self-worth to professional success.
You're listening to Marissa Miller, author of Pretty Weird, Overcoming Imposter Syndrome and Other Oddly Empowering Lessons. She's sharing information and really important information about her book, and her story. So let me go back to, you felt that you were in that awkward space where you were too normal to stand out, yet too weird to fit in. I think many people can relate to that. So what suggestions, words of advice can you give those who are feeling similarly?
Well, the first thing that I want people to realize is that they're absolutely not alone. And there's so much truth in the saying that misery loves company. You know, I want people to remember that the people you admire and put on a pedestal also go through periods of deep self-loathing and self-doubt. So remembering that can help you sort of level the playing field and begin to allow yourself the space to thrive, instead of like what I am used to doing, listening to those evil voices in your head that lie to you about your own limitations and boundaries. So life is a lot more fulfilling when you allow yourself to be your weirdest, truest self. You serve no one by trying to fit in and fitting that square peg into a circle hole, so to speak. I think I might have mixed them up. But I think weirdness is the new normal, and my dream is for people to embrace that.
You know, you're allowed to mix it up, Marissa, based on what you're saying right now. It doesn't matter. You know, you talk about the self-loathing and the self-doubt, Marissa. Sometimes this leads to challenges that people face. And in your case, I believe you were struggling with the eating disorder, weren't you?
Yes, I was. And so that was interesting for me because looking at me, you wouldn't be able to tell necessarily that I have an eating disorder because I'm not skeletal, I'm not underweight by any means. So in that vein, it took me several years to feel justified in owning the title of eating disorder patient and seeking help for it, because I assumed I would be outed as a fraud, or that this was a cry for help, or that I was looking for attention. And so that's the reason I spent so many hours as a teen hiding behind message boards talking about my eating disorder instead of, speaking to a clinician about it. So now I'm trying to shift the conversation, and that means eradicating harmful terms like, for example, atypical anorexia, which I define, or which is clinically defined as someone who practices restrictive eating patterns and behaviors, but who is at a normal weight. Your weight does not determine your eating disorder or the severity of it. It's more your behaviors and attitudes towards it. And so those who are suffering and feel that they don't fit the perfect mold of an eating disorder know that they're absolutely worthy of help and worthy of feeling their pain. It is completely justified.
Marissa, what are some of the terms that you said to yourself in terms of when you say imposter syndrome, or like you said, the negative self-talk?
Yeah, there's so many things. There's you're too weird, you're too fat, you're not smart enough. And all of these negative this self-bullying was, I think, a response to continuously comparing myself. In the book, I kind of outline how I would always compare myself to the people in the magazines, and it wasn't just the centerfold models, it was also the journalists who were writing those features about them. And I never thought that I fit the typical role of a journalist because I wasn't, let's say, particularly clued into politics. I wasn't wearing a top hat and a monocle, so to speak.
Right.
I think I call myself, I'm not a journalist, I'm a crazy cat lady with illegal access to Microsoft Word. And so growing up being told I was the weird one, it's kind of, it's still a little bit disorienting to think that I have any sort of authority in anything, let alone journalism.
And I think what contributes to that as well in this world of social media, so much pressure on everyone, particularly young adults, teenagers, and the like, which contributes to all this pressure that everyone is facing. Now, your book, Pretty Weird, appropriately titled. You must have had your ups and downs writing this book, and we have to head out to traffic, Marissa, but when we come back, we're going to hear about one of your hardest chapters that you wrote in the book. But first, let's head to the CJD Traffic Center, hear from Jill Fitzgerald.
Life Unrehearsed, brought to you by Flora Lee Senior Residences. Always there for you. Safe, reassuring, and comforting. We call it home.
I'm Matt Del Vecchio with Corrie Sirota, and we're talking to Marissa Miller about determination and grit in overcoming physical and emotional abuse. She recently published a book called Pretty Weird, Overcoming Imposter Syndrome and Other Oddly Empowering Lessons. Marissa, quite the book, and you had your ups and downs writing this book. Could you tell us about the hardest chapter that you had to write?
So the hardest chapter that I had to write was both the hardest to process and the hardest to live. One of my hardest lived experiences was my sexual assault. And there were a few reasons why it was so hard to write. So one of them is that I continue to actually be deathly afraid of my perpetrator coming after me, despite changing all identifying features in the book. I don't think a lot of people know that it happened or who it is, but there's still the chance that, word gets around. And B, because I never really allowed myself to call it sexual assault until writing that very chapter. We have this sort of collective understanding that assault needs to be this violent, dramatic display when really any sort of unwanted sexual contact totally fits the bill. So in the same way that I've developed this sort of imposter syndrome surrounding my eating disorder, so too did it take me years to fully come to terms with the fact that I was assaulted and not just touched by someone who I was not interested in.
Heavy, and I remember reading it and recognizing how heavy it was to even read it. And her writing is so descriptive, Matt, that when you're reading it, it's very, very powerful. And the metaphors that you use are incredible. So I have to ask, because I know your parents. Your parents were at my wedding 33 years ago. I'm trying to remember if Sheldon walked down the aisle. So I want to know, what was their reaction to this book?
So their reaction to the idea of me writing a book was very different than the reaction to the book. So they were so incredibly proud of me, which is not at all a surprise since they've been my absolute biggest supporters my entire career. And now they've become sort of my de facto public relations people. They're like, hey, we're Marissa's parents. They're just so funny. But there were some scenes in there that did make them choke up and cringe because, of course, they have, as my parents, this deep-seated sorrow reading at it from that vantage point. But they were, I think, amazed that they produced a child who was able to pull it together in the end and write a book. It wasn't a complete screw up. No, but
not a big surprise.
They learned a lot from me. There are some things that I wrote in the book that I had sworn I would take to my grave. And so kind of writing this book was my way of communicating those things with them and others that I kind of needed to be able to process and distill properly over multiple months at a time instead of just speaking verbally. But I think their reaction was really, they were very proud, and they continue to be, and I couldn't be more thankful for that.
As they should be. You're listening to Life Unrehearsed. Matt Del Vecchio here with Corrie Sirota, and we're talking to Marissa Miller about determination and grit in overcoming physical and emotional abuse, as you've just heard. And she recently published this incredible book called Pretty Weird, Overcoming Imposter Syndrome and Other Oddly Empowering Lessons. And Marissa, like you said, it's one thing writing the book, but I'm sure as it's published, it's like, okay, this is going to be out there now. And I'm sure you must have been a little nervous, perhaps. And what response were you hoping to receive?
It's funny because once I start to anticipate reactions, that only sets me up for disappointment. So
True.
What I did was I just tried to write the very best book that I could possibly muster and said the Shema Yisrael and sent it off to the publisher and hoped for the best. But thankfully the response has been beyond my wildest dreams, incredible. I'm thrilled to learn that it's helped people feel more seen and understood than they had in their entire lives. And that's very gratifying for me. It almost feels like I'm getting away with murder writing this book because it was such a joy to write. Even though I contend with very difficult topics, I basically just barfed my entire soul onto the page and got a book deal out of it. So there's hope for fellow weirdos out there like me.
I'm so encouraged and in awe, as I think I told you even before off air, that I put on my therapist hat and I say the therapeutic value of it is also tremendous. But more importantly, for you to have not taken this stuff to your grave, but gotten it out there and really been a role model for so many others that are struggling. So let me ask you, what are some of your takeaways?
My takeaways is that, well, in terms like what, sorry, can you rephrase as in like, what did I get out of writing the book?
Yes.
Or,
Yeah. Let's do
is
that one.
There's really no point in being ashamed of anything because we all go through this messy, complicated, and painful human experience. And to deny ourselves the privilege of coming together over that is a huge disservice to everyone. This is our chance to get vulnerable with each other, to talk about our bathroom habits, to talk about our childhood traumas. I just really want to open a dialogue so that no one else has to feel alone as I did.
This is so nice. I mean, I have to ask, Marissa, now that it's all over and done with and you're starting to get these wonderful reactions, and I'm sure it must be really gratifying to get some feedback that you've actually helped others that may have been in these very difficult situations that you were in as well. So now you got a bit of the bug. Any thoughts about perhaps a follow-up?
It's funny because now everything that happens in my life, I'm like, book two, working this into the plot line.
Fair enough.
I think, it's like Lay's chips. Once you write, you can't just write them.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Marissa, for your time, for your energy, for your honesty.
Thank you very much
for coming out and having this, doing this interview with us. That's Marissa Miller, author of Pretty Weird: Overcoming Imposter Syndrome and Other Oddly Empowering Lessons. Please go get yourself a copy. Marissa, where can they find them?
You can get it, obviously shopping local is preferred. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Books A Million, IndieBound, Apple Books, basically anywhere and everywhere.
Way to go. Well, congratulations and wish you the best of luck, Marissa.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Most welcome. Corrie, we have a very interesting show next week coming up. What do we have?
We do. Next week, we're going to hear from broadcasting legend Dick Irvin, and he is going to talk about his most memorable Habs stories. And we'll also be discussing some helpful tips and valuable advice for families requiring home care for a loved one.
Yeah, so home care, big topic these days. And while the Habs are in playoff mode, big victory, so grateful to have Dick Irvin. And boy, he's been around. He's going to tell us some incredible stories. So thank you for tuning in to Life Unrehearsed. As a reminder, for all your inquiries or assistance with retirement homes, seniors residences, or downsizing, it'd be my pleasure to help. Our services are completely free. Call me at Lianas Senior Transition Support. The number is 514-622-8074 or lianasservices.com. Many thanks to our technical producer, Jimmy G. And you can listen to Life Unrehearsed here on CJD 800 every Saturday at 3 p.m.
Life Unrehearsed, brought to you by Lianas Senior Transition Support, specialists in downsizing and seniors residences.